There was recently some chatter and complaints across social media that dungeon masters and players are having to fix Dungeons & Dragons for Wizards of the Coast. GameMasters here, and the complaints are that Wizards has not provided to dungeon masters the proper tools to run a campaign, and that the rules in place are muddy. And I'm going to disagree a bit here, though I will fully admit that the tools they do provide are peppered throughout different books, and some elements are harder to locate, and I'll touch on that a little later in the video. And we'll also go into the muddy rules as well, but I can't help but feel that, in part, it's really my generation of dungeon masters that has failed, and not exactly Wizards of the Coast. As I said, at least in part, and I'll explain. But first, grab yourself a cup of coffee, a soda, or a sandwich. Go ahead and pause this video, get your supplies. This is going to be a bit of a longer video than I normally do, and I've got a lot to say, both on where the blame is and what the fix should be, but I'm also going to provide to you exactly where the tools are that can help you DM better. I'm going to break this down into very cohesive chapters, so feel free to bookmark this video and rewatch the chapters that are important to you. So again, go ahead, pause it, grab your supplies, and we'll resume. Ready? Okay, it breaks down like this. Back in my day, no, this isn't going to be one of those kind of videos. I'm just giving you a slight bit of context. We didn't have source book after source book of material. We had the three core books, the DM's Guide, the Player's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Modules and our imagination. Homebrewing was in its infancy. There were no methods of creating your own town or city. We used modules that took us from point A to point B with very little creative deviation. And when we did create our own maps, we used graph paper and just randomly scribbled things out. DMing was, by today's comparison, not overly challenging. We swiftly outgrew those modules and still wanted to play, so we started creating our own stuff, and eventually we went whole hog and created our own worlds. We didn't have any tools to derive exactly how to do this. We just used the modules that did exist and pulled in inspiration from movies and books. Graph paper helped a lot, and we would just draw random blobby shapes onto the paper and decide where trees were, what water was, and where towns were, and of course where the dragon and where the dungeon was. Eventually in the mid-1990s, TSR came out with, and keep in mind this is still in the era of advanced Dungeons & Dragons, a book called World Builder's Guidebook. This was in response to our complaints that there was nothing out there to help us create settings. This book provided tables on creating land masses, towns, kingdoms, pretty much everything. But it also opened our eyes to something else. This book mentioned taking already existing maps and tweaking them. It talked about pulling inspiration from books like Lord of the Rings or from comics like Conan the Barbarian, and we already were doing that. All this thing really did was give us tables to randomly roll on. So what's the eye-opening thing? Well, we realized that what we had been doing all along, creating everything for ourselves, pulling inspiration from random places, was perfectly fine. We had complained that we were lacking tools. TSR provided them, only for us to realize that we just paid for tools that we had already forged. And forged, that is a great word. This is the era where DMs were forged through massive trial and error. And remember that phrase, trial and error. It's also where homebrewing really began to take hold as well. But again, more on that in a little bit. In the intro, I spoke about that it was in part my generation of dungeon masters that may have failed. Now, to elaborate, you guys now know where my generation came from. We made things up as we went along with little official source material. As such, we learned from each other, pulled a lot from Dungeon Magazine, a lot from Dragon Magazine, but mostly after seeing that we paid for a book that we more or less already knew the contents of, we started getting super creative. Hell, I even still have my notebook of DM secrets that I started in the early 1900s, the early 90s. The point is, we didn't have an older generation to learn from. Aside from direct input from the folks that created the game, we were left to our own devices to figure out all of this on our own. Now here's where my generation's failing comes to play. And I'm not saying that this is true or factual of all dungeon masters that are 50 years or older, but there will be a sliver of truth in this. We were left to our own devices to create what didn't exist. I'm sure that there are many others out there that feel today's dungeon master should be doing the same. After all, there is so much more material that exists today than it did back in my day. See how I tied that knot? But the failing is that we have rarely passed our secrets to the next generation of DMs. The phrase that I used a moment ago, trial and error, we perfected methods of DMing, but some have been very reluctant to pass on those successes and push them forward. I've tried to help new people over the years get into DMing Dungeons and Dragons, as well as other games too. Vampire the Masquerade, Cthulhu, GURPS, Paranoia, Little Fears, role-playing games. And to a heavy extent, that's what this channel is all about. It's about me sharing my knowledge as a game master to anyone who sticks with the videos and watches. In fact, I'll use this opportunity right now to say that if you're enjoying this video, if you get anything out of it, please hit that like button. It helps to recommend it to others, and I thank you. I've seen across Reddit, across Discord, Twitter, other social media sites, about someone wanting to get into Dungeons and Dragons, getting the DM's guide, but then flipping through some of the pages and putting the whole thing down because it was just too much for them. Information was all over the place. I've rarely seen older DMs jump in to provide pointers. Instead, what I read are responses like, "It's not too difficult of a game to learn," and that's it. Like, that little 7-word sentence is going to make a change. Or someone will ask, where do I find, pick a random class, a druid's hit dice, and what exactly are hit dice? And the reply will be, read the fucking DM's guide. Again, not much of a help, and a total failure on that DM that provided that answer. Most DMs started out as players. Either they wanted to give their hand at trying to run a game, or they were talked into DMing by the other players. And yeah, being a DM is not easy. There are many times where the DM will put in a lot of planning and hard work on location C's encounter, only for the players to deviate from the path, bypass location C by a few miles, and in a little bit we'll revisit this exact scenario once we get into the tools section of this video. I've given out several copies of the core books, the DM's Guide, Player's Handbook, and Monster Manual over the years to folks wanting to get into Dungeons and Dragons. Some are still DMing strong, some I've lost touch with over the years, and others have given me the books back or have in turn given them to someone else. Most instances that I have seen of someone giving up on DMing has not been from a lack of official tools. It's been from, and get ready for the controversy, a lack of confidence in being able to run the game. And I'll cover that in depth in a moment, but there's no question that a lack of confidence doesn't take into account the muddy rules. Well, time has been a factor for several DMs that I know to just stop running it. Life gets in the way. And while I won't address that element, I will go into the muddy rules. Yeah, I admit the rules, especially in 5th edition, are a bit muddy. Some of them are. One of the more recent examples I can think of is the Herringen trait, Rabbit Hop. Herringen are more or less large bipedal rabbits that players can play as. Their Rabbit Hop trait reads, as a bonus action, you can jump a number of feet equal to 5 times your proficiency bonus without provoking opportunity attacks. Jump, as the rule is written, reads, your strength determines how far you can jump. To long jump, you cover a number of feet up to your strength score if you move at least 10 feet on foot immediately before the jump. A standing jump leaps half that distance. When you make a high jump, you leap into the air a number of feet equal to 3 plus your strength modifier if you move at least 10 feet on foot immediately before the jump. Making a standing high jump, you jump only half that distance. And that's where this one's muddy rule comes into play. If I'm playing Herringen and want to just jump a long jump, I use my strength. But if I want to use Rabbit Hop, I can use my proficiency bonus instead. Well, what if I'm a caster Herringen and cast the spell Jump on myself? Further, is Rabbit Hop considered a high jump or a long jump? It reads as if it could be both. How does that get resolved? There was such an uproar about this specific rabbit folk just wanting to know how it could jump that Wizards of the Coast posted specific rules online on how to resolve the, well, muddiness of it. Another rule brought up is all about falling damage. The Player's Handbook states, at the end of a fall, a creature takes 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet it fell, to a maximum of 20d6. The creature lands prone unless it avoids taking damage from the fall. There was a joke back in advanced Dungeons & Dragons days about monks being able to fall from orbit and survive, and now pretty much anyone can fall from orbit and will take a maximum of 120 damage. Listen, as you get up in levels, you are likely to have way more than 120 hit points. And on top of that, if you have something that grants to you resistance or immunity to bludgeoning damage, you've just found a broken element in the rules that allows you to 100% survive a fall from the Karaman line. That's roughly 62 miles up. And this is where arguments come into play about rules as written versus rules as intended. While we can certainly read that falling damage word for word, it's easy enough to determine what it says. It's very plain and simple. Yes, Strictly as the rule is written, the maximum damage you will take is 120. Some ask, is that what they really mean though? And that's where rules as intended comes into play. We have a house rule that falling a significant distance is going to cause damage regardless of what is written in the rule book. And we have other house rules that take on other, well, in my opinion, absurd rules as they are written. And that's for another video though. But this ties into homebrewing. At a certain point, the official books are just not going to cover the things you are wanting. You will start to seek out answers online and are likely to run across material that other dungeon masters and players have tweaked and created. This material is considered to be homebrewing. And I told you we'd get back to this one. And also, it's in my opinion that this is really where Dungeons and Dragons shines. Wizards highly encourages folks to create their own material. Keep in mind everything, all source books are guides only. All of it can be changed to suit your specific needs or can be changed to plug in a gap where you have discovered one. And for those marching to the rules as written, the Dungeon Master's Guide fully allows this and encourages it. In fact, the introduction cites the D&D rules help you and the other players have a good time, but the rules aren't in charge. You're the DM, and you are in charge of the game. If during the course of play something isn't working, change it. If something isn't there that you need, create it. If the players have discovered Minzo Baranzan, and you need a good aligned beholder that is acting as a bad guy, but has been hired by someone in Waterdeep to find his missing daughter, by all means, create a good aligned beholder. Homebrew the tar out of this game if you want. That's exactly what we did back in my day. And I can't help but feel that it is this element that is the main complaint. That's where it stems from. Folks feeling like they have to fix Dungeons and Dragons for Wizards, and I just can't see it as being broken. I can create whatever I want. If I want to create a laser gun and a jetpack using the Dungeon Master's Guide, I can. I mean, check this out. Even shows this super cool illustration right next to a chart depicting alien technology. More on that a little bit later too. I really feel that homebrewing has become the core that is D&D. Yes, I love all the source books. It grants me a basis to build off of, but it's very rare, at least for me, to run players through any given setting from plot point A to plot point B all the way to Z. Take Rime of the Frost Maiden. When it first came out, I absorbed all the material that I could from it. It has clear-cut adventures, but what my players experienced was more of a mix and match, mishmash combination of different elements that was in that book. Let's look at Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel and Spelljammer. At the time that I'm making this video, neither have been released, but I know what the core information of both of those settings are, and I'm able to currently run adventures in those settings. How? All because of homebrewing, imagination, and confidence. A bit earlier in the video, I said that I had seen folks give up on DMing, not because of a lack of official tools, but rather from a lack of confidence in being able to run a game. Quite recently, I was in the back end of a conversation with Chris from Dungeons and Dummies and was looking to get into being a dungeon master. And the specific concern addressed was, I don't feel Wizards has done anything to help me learn to DM. When asked what needed to be learned, the reply was, like, literally everything, LOL. The DMG and whatnot, I feel, gives you the bare minimum on what you need to run the game, but it doesn't line up with what the expectation people have because of stuff like Critical Role and Dimension 20. The power tilts too much to the player versus what the enemies are capable of. How do you build a world? How do you create a campaign? How do you make monsters unique? Monster templates? How do you incorporate backstories? The list goes on. I get that some stuff fails to the DM to figure out, but I don't really feel Wizards gives a good enough foundation for people to build on. And that is very valid. Is it from a lack of confidence? Well, no, but also yes. Let me explain. The DMG is full of in-depth information, but again, we have always been encouraged to create what is missing. The issue here is, how can you create something if you don't actually know if it's missing or not? It's a vast book, lots of nuances. And I'll go back to the falling damage example. What if Chris, through poring over all of the pages, missed that one small part and made up a rule that just kind of felt correct? Yeah, I get it. There is a concern there. And players that are wanting to dip their toes into DMing for the first time, they draw from the DM that they have been playing under and from episodic adventures like Critical Role and Dimension 20. And what they see are experienced DMs that have been doing this for a long time, and they want to be able to enthrall players as well and wow the players and inspire awe on night one, roll one of the dice. And while that could potentially happen, it's not likely to happen. Chris asks, how do you build a world? How do you create a campaign? How do you make monsters unique? It's actually all right here in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but I will admit that the information is kind of peppered throughout the book. And I realize that Chris is just firing off some random initial questions that the DMG does answer, but that does not invalidate his questions, nor should Chris's concerns be dismissed. I think it's very easy to say that if someone has a concern like that, it's most certainly valid, until it's not. Hell, one of my biggest complaints is that books being released nowadays are a combination of information all shoved into the same tone. Take Wild Beyond the Witchlight, for example. You have 2 new races. We briefly mentioned the Harengon, but you also can play as a fairy. Those 2 entries have information that are a must-read for any player wanting to play them, but other parts of the book are really set up to be for Dungeon Master's eyes only. I don't like the combination of the 2 in one book. So here's where his concern becomes beyond valid. With all of the DM information that is out there, that foundation is vastly spread out, and information can become difficult to find if you are just now today trying to jump into running the game. Given the logistics behind compiling every tidbit of knowledge that a DM might need to know that has been released in every official Wizards D&D product into a singular tome would be a challenge within itself, although their recent acquisition of D&D Beyond does make searching for information a bit easier. But again, if you're not sure what you are needing to look up, I'll go back to falling damage. I didn't even know it existed because I missed it when I did my initial read through, so I made up my own rule and just never bothered to look it up again because our homebrew rule worked just fine. Then yeah, that's kind of going to go hand in hand with muddy rules. Maybe we can refer to that as phantom rules. I don't know. The rules are there, but just so many of them that we just don't know where to even begin to look. A simple solution would be for Wizards. Note, I'm encouraging Wizards of the Coast to fix this. Not a player, not a DM. But a simple solution would be for Wizards to create an all-encompassing index. Something that many of their books, for unknown reasons, as of late, just don't seem to include. Now, why did I include Chris's statement and question as being in part of due to a lack of confidence? Chris is most certainly not lacking in confidence, but rather has hesitation about running Dungeons & Dragons. Chris specifically mentioned Critical Role and Dimension 20 as examples of an ideal game. What this tells me is that there is already a comparison to 2 groups that excel at not only running a game, but also at storytelling. And yeah, looking at these guys run their game, they are masters of their craft. No one should expect to be able to pull off what Critical Role can do right out of the box. We've established what the main issue is, but what about the fix? What can be done to keep someone around and not see them run off due to being overwhelmed, frustrated, or made to feel like they lack the confidence to keep the table happy and entertained? In short, well, the answer really is read the book. To aptly run a D&D game, knowledge of what is in the Dungeon Master's Guide is important. But equally important is knowing that you don't have to know every rule out there. Do you really think that Mercer has every page number memorized or every monster stat block right there in the front of his brain? His trick is he's been doing this for a long time. It's kind of what he does for a living, so his 9-to-5 job consists of getting better at his craft. What do you do for a living? Pour concrete? Make cakes? Do IT work all day? Manage YouTube accounts? Run a print shop? That's your craft. That's what you do from 9 to 5 each day. You aren't honing your dungeon mastering skills. That's realization number 1. D&D, while most of us would love for it to be our main focus in life, chances are it's not. You gotta make that money and pay those bills, put that food in your mouth, and that's your 9-to-5 job that's going to do that. Could you eventually get to Mercer status? Well, if you have enough time in the day to do that, sure, and enough drive. But for the most part, we just want our weekend session to be fun and entertaining, and comparing your style to his, or anyone else's for that matter, well, thinking like that is just going to diminish your own capabilities. Are there DMs out there that can do what Mercer does? Sure, hell, there are DMs out there that can even surpass what Critical Role does, but they have also had years of experience doing it.
So is that the fix? Just rack up experience points in my dungeon mastering DC saves and read the DM's guide?
No, I mean, partly yeah. You will need to spend more than 10 minutes trying to find something, and then you'll need to actually read it. But there is so much more to it. I realize that everyone wants cohesive answers all in one place, and that's just not going to happen. Well, short of, as we mentioned, Wizards of the Coast putting together a massive index that continuously gets updated. And that's the blunt truth of it. When a new book comes out, there's going to be new nuances to older established rules. And if you want to make use of those new nuances, you'll need that new book, or not. Listen, that's the absolute beauty of this game. It's 100% up to you as the DM to run your game however you want. That isn't something that is exclusive to 5th edition. That's a concept that goes all the way back to the beginning. Want to call it bending the rules or homebrewing? Fine, call it what you will. But it's ultimately your game. Do you want to make a monster that looks like a small, harmless little bunny, but is actually the most foul, cruel, and bad-tempered rodent that your players will ever set eyes on? Go for it! Want to give it powers and abilities of a Tarrasque? Nothing's going to stop you. The fix that I propose: Dungeon Masters watching this, when a new player approaches you with questions, answer them. Don't be a dick and berate them. Point them in the right direction. And if you don't know the answer, fine, admit that. So yeah, I mean, who cares that we had to look stuff up in the beginning? And it was all trial and error until we settled in on something that worked. But, you know, now you have the ability to impart your knowledge onto someone else. You get to be the true dungeon master and teach an apprentice. How cool is it that the culmination of your experience can be passed on? Someone has recognized your legacy and is seeking your advice. And I'm going to tell you right here, right now, I am always willing to help anyone who wants to get into running a D&D game, or any other RPG for that matter. I've run a lot, and while Dungeons & Dragons is the more popular game at the moment, there are still pockets of other people out there that enjoy games like Werewolf, and of course, loads of folks are getting into the new Marvel multiverse role-playing game. Ask me questions, I'll do my best to answer. Now, all of this said, I do have to throw in that the only time in which you cannot get totally creative is when you're running an Adventurers League game. That's the Wizards' official organized play campaign for D&D. There are very specific rules that you need to adhere to and other guidelines, but that's for a completely different video. I also want to share with you a few hidden gems of information and where in the Dungeon Master's Guide to find them. But first, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The biggest key to keeping players engaged and entertained isn't about the rules found in any given book. It's about telling a damn good story. Confidence certainly comes into play to be a convincing storyteller, but imagination also plays, pardon a pun, a critical role as well. Pull inspiration from movies, books, comics, or even your own day-to-day experiences. Don't be afraid to write a story and then use that as a basis for an adventure. Just remove the characters you wrote about and let your party members take over. Did you love Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King? Well, what if your players were participants in that and they were the ones that were tasked with saving Queen Sasha? One of the few times that I got to play, a friend of mine, Jody, was DMing a game with me and Chris, a different Chris, as players. We made our way up to a monastery and found ourselves wrapped up in a bizarre case of murders, but the victims all had these strange black marks on their hands and mouths. It wasn't until 2 years later that we realized we had kind of run through the novel The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. This would have been around the year, I don't know, 91, 92. The point is, we had so much fun playing that memory is forever burned into my mind. And that's the exact experience that I want each and every one of my players to have. To remember something so specific about playing a role-playing game. Jody was great at running the game. And in fact, he ran me through my first session of Mage the Ascension as well. And I could easily recall the exact adventure. I really was working hard at trying to become a Time Lord. Point is, you want to be confident in your storytelling skills that your players are going to remember it for years. To refer back to the first line of this video about complaints that dungeon masters are having to fix Dungeons & Dragons for Wizards of the Coast, listen, Wizards is never going to be able to fix or provide tools to make anyone a better storyteller. That's a skill that you have to work on, hone, and mold. Yeah, you can read how-to books, but if you lack that skill set or just flat out don't want to tell a story, gotta be honest, DMing is going to be a challenge for you. That doesn't mean that you can't perfect the skill set. And if you're already good at telling a story, then you've got a great advantage. Now to the second element of the initial complaint, muddy rules. This is also a fairly simple fix. You're the DM. Make a rule and move forward. Yeah. There's always going to be players that want to argue until they're blue in the face about rabbit hop versus long jump. versus high jump. But at the end of the day, as the DM, it's your world, it's your physics. I've got a standing rule I establish in session 0 of my games. Rule number 1, if a 10-inch schlong grows out of your forehead, that's exactly what happens. No save, no avoiding it. And I'll tell you, in my 35 years or so of running a game, I've never once had to make that happen. I don't tolerate rules lawyers in my game, and that's not to say that I can't listen to reason. There are plenty of rules in these books, and I know that I can't possibly keep up with all of them. I've certainly encountered my fair share of, but the rule says this and you did it wrong. And yeah, I'll go back on my own view and my own ruling of how something happened, as I simply misunderstood that rule. But when a player begins to hammer away that an attack roll made by a red dragon shouldn't do what I had it do, or that an ability that a player was trying to do was a botched roll and they want to just keep trying until they succeed, listen, you can't lie to a guard, tell him that you're king, and fail that bluff, get caught in the lie, and then attempt to successfully lie again. That's just not going to happen. Then, you know what? Yeah, my ruling, it's final. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also state that sometimes you gotta adapt and flow as a DM. I get it. You spent 15 hours writing up the perfect adventure. The players are hired to find a magic item. You've got it hidden in a cave west of town. But they don't know that. So they look around, check out the bakery, somehow convince a harbor master to get them onto a boat, and now they've set sail out to sea. But your cave is back that way. Well, easy. Storm comes up, the ship is now beached on an island that has a cave. Flow and adapt. Perhaps you've created the ultimate big bad evil guy, and your players square up against him and pull out a trick you've simply forgotten that they could do, and they best the guy like that. But you really need him to be alive because it's going to pop up in a later section of your campaign. Yeah, that's a tough one. But have you ever played Elden Ring? Phase 2. And then your bad guy gives his speech and vanishes. Point is, you are most certainly going to face times where you've got something very specific planned, but your players just don't go that direction. Adapt and flow. Sometimes, too, you could even just flat out give the players some hinting information. You might not want to get on that boat. Looks like a mighty storm is brewing off in the distance. Or, you've beaten the evil monster. He looks as if he's on death's door, but it also looks like he's struggling to say something. Speaking of information, I want to point out some hidden gems of information and goodies found in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Obviously, if you're going to take on the task of running a D&D game, you really should read this book. There are all kinds of goodies inside, as well as tips and pointers on not only how to run a game, but also on various styles of games, the flavor of the game. For example, if you want to play a heroic fantasy game, kind of the bread and butter that is Dungeons and Dragons, details can be found on page 38. If you want to play a more mythic fantasy where ancient gods might come down, think Clash of the Titans here, details are listed on page 39. Pages 40 and 41 detail out even more styles. Chapter 2 of the book, starting on page 43, goes into detail as how to exactly create your own world in multiverse. It details out the various planes that exist. No, not airplanes. I'm talking about places like the astral plane, the Feywild, the ethereal plane, which is where the radiant crystal exists, by the way. The Shadowfell, the plane of air, plane of fire, plane of earth, plane of water. And I mean, the list goes on and on. But they are all in here. And what's more, it also gives tips on how to connect them. No, it doesn't go into detail as to their exact shape or really even the specific types of creatures you should populate them with. That's all up to you. But rest assured, there is a plethora of information about the various planes of existence, and you can use that information to help you decide which one best suits the campaign world you want to create. Chapter 3 goes into details about creating adventures and the type of content, and even provides examples of different types of adventures and includes various tables, such as, well, let's say you wanted to put together something that had your party delving deep into a dungeon. Why? Why are they going in there? There's a table in here that can help you with that. Likewise, let's say you need your party to head off into the wilderness. Again, why? Yep, table for that too. As you gain experience, you'll rely less and less on those tables, but for a quick and dirty, I want to create something, the various tables found in that chapter, major help. It also details how to build a good villain, how to include side quests and random encounters. Chapter 4 is all about crafting up your non-player characters. You know, the folks that your party will need to interact with, the barkeeper, or the skipper of the ship and his first mate. Perhaps a filthy rich, well-to-do and his wife, or a wanting to be successful bard, or perhaps an alchemist, or maybe even a woman who needs help with wicked plants growing in her garden. I spoke of hidden gems, and here is one. Back in the advanced D&D era, we had henchmen, NPCs that we could hire to do various tasks, carry out our equipment, keep guard while we slept, maintain our keep when we had one, even fight alongside us. Many players overlook this in 5th edition, but here on pages 92, 93, and 94, it details how followers work. Talks about an optional rule called loyalty. This is basically how dedicated the NPC is to the player or party and to what extent they will help. This chapter also provides some nice tables to help flesh out villains. Every good adventure has to have some kind of bad guy. Perhaps the one in your adventure is trying to trigger a natural disaster by controlling the weather, or at least is trying to make it look like a natural disaster. Perhaps the means of eradicating this villain is done by finding a special weapon that deals extra damage only when specifically used against this guy. That's all from tables found in this chapter. Chapter 5 is all about the environment in which your adventure will take place, the locations as well as the condition. It also talks a bit about how to map out a dungeon, its features, things like secret doors or air quality, its hazards, things like, monsters and traps. It goes into detail about the same things if your adventure takes place within the wilderness as well. There are also tables on how to craft various settlements, so you can build an entire village or town just from the information found in this section. Want to craft up an underwater adventure? Yeah, you can do that too. That's found on pages 116 to 119. And I mentioned traps just a moment ago. You'll find loads of them here on page 120. Hidden gem, be very cautious about tossing the last trap detailed in this chapter into your adventure. I tried it once, total party kill, was not pretty. Chapter 6, and this is an important one. When we play D&D, our thoughts are mostly of combat and dungeon delving, but sometimes the players need good pause from the adventure. I'm not saying that you need to take a break from playing the game, not at all. Play the game on your regular game night, but Chapter 6 details out what to do in the downtime. There's a little blurb here at the beginning, and yeah, I'll consider it to be a hidden gem. It says, a campaign is much more than a series of adventures. It includes the moments between them, the various distractions and side pursuits that engage the characters. This is so far beyond important to incorporate into your game. Let me break it down slightly different way. Your real life adventure is what? Your day-to-day job. What is that? For me, it's running a print shop. I love that I can do that, and it brings in money to pay the bills, which is what the players would be doing when dungeon delving. But like me, when I'm done at work, I need to rewind, relax. And I cannot stress this enough. Your players, and I'm talking about the actual people playing their characters, need a session every now and again that's just relaxing and fun. Role play up a meal at the local tavern, or let them seek out a method of crafting a new weapon. This chapter, Chapter 6, talks all about how to do that. Chapter 7, and this one will perhaps be the most used section in the entire book. It details out what various magic items and treasures are out there, as well as what they do. From a mundane signet garnet gem to a legendary, the legendary hand and eye of Vecna. I can't really provide any hidden gems for this section. Hell, everything in it is a hidden gem. And I suppose the best one really would be the deck of many things. It's perhaps the most tempting of all magic items to place in the game. Everybody's pretty much heard of it. And the cards can certainly add a level of chaotic fun to your game, but do be careful if you choose to add it, because there are some effects that can happen that can permanently alter your world and your characters. One hidden gem that can be found on page 214, and that's how to create a sentient magic item. As a quick aside, to create regular magic items, you're going to find that over in Chapter 9 towards the end of the chapter. But how messed up would it be to create an item, let's say a coin, that can actually communicate telepathically to the character that's holding it, while at the same time providing some form of vision enhancement? This part will help explain how to do that, and if you need to be even more powerful, the item to be more powerful, convert that sucker into an artifact. You'll find that on page 218. Chapter 8. Okay, so chapters 8 and 9, these pages are just chocked full of hidden gems. I mean, it's all right there to read. But listen, I'll be the first to admit, I've not read this book from cover to cover, word for word. These pages go over issues like table rules, who's going to bring snacks, how long you can take to determine what your character is going to do, what happens if a player can't make it to game night, how to quell metadata knowledge. That would be if a player knows that a skeleton, the actual person playing knows that the skeleton is weak to blunt damage, but their character's never fought a skeleton, that's using out-of-game knowledge to give their character an advantage, stuff like that. Chapter 8 also goes into detail about the role of the dice. No, not how they roll, but what their role is, their function, and provides some creative ways to make use of them and to make the game a bit more engaging, and even talks about even not using them. Hidden gem time, ignoring the dice. Here's what it mentions. Let's say the party is searching for a secret door. One approach is to have them make a wisdom or a perception check or an intelligence investigation roll. This method suggests not even using dice. Instead, let the players verbally describe how they're searching, tapping on the walls or twisting or turning a sconce or pulling or pushing various books on a bookshelf. If that's enough to convince you that they could find a secret door, there's no need for a dice check. That can make the game a bit more immersive as well. Oh, and another hidden gem, and I hate to even say this, I've been running D&D for years. Going back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons days, running 5th edition since the moment it came out, and I've never seen this part of the DM's guide. Actually, hold on. In my tenure of running games, one of my favorites was Call of Cthulhu. I love the deep horror of it, the potential for the player to lose their sanity. So I made up my own homebrew rules for sanity for 5th edition. Been using it for years. In a tweet, I mentioned that it was sad that D&D didn't have official sanity rules. Then, it was pointed out to me on pages 258, 259, and 260 that it did in fact have such rules. That's crazy. Pun intended, most definitely. For years, I've been running 5th edition and I only found these specific madness rules like a month ago. So listen, don't feel like you gotta know everything. Trust me, you're still gonna run across something you've never heard of before, regardless of how long you've been running the game or how well you think you know the rules. Chapter 9 goes into optional ways to play, optional rules. For example, it talks about optional rules for resting, suggesting that for gritty realism, a short rest would be considered to be 8 hours and a long rest is considered to be 7 days. The idea here is that this is to get the players to heavily consider their actions in terms of fighting and how quickly they can heal and recover. So it's not just a march into one battle after another. But in my opinion, and I told you we'd get back to this, the hidden gem in this chapter is alien technology. Brought it up earlier. You can find it on page 268, but check this out. You've got stats on grenades, automatic rifles, pistols, even laser rifles, and antimatter guns. Do I suggest dishing out a laser rifle to every party member? Nah, but toss one in at some point. Perhaps the battery pack runs out, but it does make for some pretty cool stuff happening and will leave the characters scratching their heads going, what in the world is this? Chapter 9 also details out how to create your own monster. In a similar fashion to Chapter 4's villain, this provides a step-by-step guide on creating a monster from what to name it to what abilities to give it. And you're even provided tables to quickly make up a monster if you need one on the fly. Finally, we have reached the appendix. The Dungeon Master's Guide has 4 of them. Random dungeons. This one is pretty cool. This is a mix of different tables that you can roll on to randomly craft a dungeon, from passages to stairs to door types to chambers. It also details out the different types of dungeons. Is it a maze? Is it full of traps? Is it a lair of some nasty creature? What state is the dungeon in? Is it freshly carved? Is it dilapidated? What's in it? Like, what inhabits it? What kind of items can be found within? Magic treasure or something more mundane like a ruined, waterlogged book? The tables in this section help you detail everything out that you might need. The next appendix is the monsters lists. More tables. And these are all about various monsters that players might encounter in various areas. Stuff like a giant scorpion or a young blue dragon if they're traveling through a desert, or perhaps a flying snake or allosaurus if they're moving through marshy grasslands. What's cool about this section is that it details the potential experience that each creature might give up when it's bested. It also sorts all of the monsters that can be found in the monster manual by challenge rating. Hidden Gem, the Tarrasque, has the highest challenge rating, again as found in the monster manual, with a CR of 30. Maps are the next appendix, and while you are only provided with 9, it's really more designed to give you a fast map should you ever need one. Trust me though, while these are handy, there's a good chance that if you've made it this far into the video, you're more than likely going to be creating and crafting your own maps. Why do I say that? Listen, simply put, this has been a long video, and if you've stuck with me up to this point, you've got a dedication to the game, and that dedication, simply put, means that you have what it takes to be a damn fine dungeon master. And that, of course, means you're ready to take on the book by the pages and start crafting your own worlds. The last appendix here, and it's, I gotta be honest, a bit of pure fluff. It's roughly half a page. Most of it's taken up by an image, and it's a really cool, fun illustration, but that still consumes an area with more information, with where more information could go. But you are provided with books and sources for further Dungeon Master inspiration. And the funny thing is, Lord of the Rings is not listed. Though, to be fair, the books listed are more focused on storytelling rather than the actual story or rules. For example, it lists the Stephen King book on writing, which is all about perfecting your writing craft and telling an interesting story, which is really the heart of what the Dungeon Master's Guide is all about. Telling an interesting story. The final bit of this book is the index. You're going to use this part a lot. And if I did have to point out one major flaw and lodge a major complaint with Wizards of the Coast, you guys have heard it previously, it would be that with a lot of their newer books, they just flat out don't include a damn index. That topic's come up a couple of times in this video, but that's the cold hard fact that justifies the complaint that some things are just difficult to find in any given book. I know I read about, in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, about a spell that granted resistance to bludgeoning damage. Something about stars. But guess what? I can't find it because there's no index listed. Instead, we get, as the final pages of that book, player handouts, but no index. So yeah, some complaints are certainly valid, but that we have to fix Dungeons and Dragons for Wizards of the Coast? Nah, I don't agree with that. That they have failed to provide Dungeon Masters with tools with which to craft a game or build a world? No, those tools are most certainly here in the DMG. I'm not dismissing someone else's complaint about it. I'm not trying to invalidate it. I'm just simply seeing solutions and workarounds. Things that I've been implementing for years. And listen, I'm more than happy to share with you my take on the rules, and I'm certainly happy to share my DMing history with anyone who has a question. In fact, feel free to ask away any questions that you may have in the comments below, or leave a comment in general if your view of D&D is vastly different. Just keep it respectful. Take a gander at this video. The YouTube algorithm thinks it's the best one to watch as a follow-up to what we've just been chatting about. And until next our paths cross, may your adventures be filled with excitement, great storytelling, and, well, adventure.